Hi guys, Dan here. It's been 8 months since I did an update about what podcasts I'm listening to right now. So this will be a longer one. Will this be a video blog or not? No, it will not be a video blog. This will be an update on what podcasts I'm listening to right now. I did one for April and now I'm doing another one and things have changed. So here are some podcast recommendations. Right now I'm binge listening to my favorite murder. True crime is very popular. I have had success with true crime podcasts in 2016 and I'm binge listening to my favorite murder, as I said. Karen Kilgariff and Georgia Hardstark. They are not too hot on research, but they are so fun. They just sit in a couch and discuss murder. And it kind of works. I learned about that podcast when I listened to Last Podcast on the Left because they did an episode with my favorite murder. It's not nearly as good as Last Podcast on the Left, but I've listened to all those episodes. So that's my binge listening right now. Proper to the People was the first podcast I was on. It is cancelled since long ago, but I was searching this podcast for my first podcast episode and I will upload that to this channel. My very first podcast. It's my very first experience of podcasting. My first job as a co-host and my first guest appearance, of course, before that. This one, the Unresolved podcast, really good. If you listen to my serial killer podcasts, and that podcast is bigger than all my other podcasts combined, and I'm doing 9 podcasts right now. But Seriemördarpodden is the big success. And I've noticed that the listeners, I do like resolved cases, unresolved cases, and Nordic cases. And the resolved cases are the most popular. But for me, the unresolved cases are the most popular. And the Unresolved podcast, they do only unresolved crimes. And I love it. But it suffers from a big problem. This guy who's doing this podcast, he is not very regular with it. I wish he just said, I'm doing this once a month, but he's just the episodes are just appearing randomly, and that's kind of sad. But I definitely recommend it, and it was a short binge listen. Obiter Dictum is by a guy who listens to Palmemordet, and they did a great episode about P2 in Swedish, the Italian Freemason lodge that sort of went haywire or went out of hand. This is How to Make It. This is the podcast also in Swedish about super successful entrepreneurs. And this is made by a friend of mine, and this is the studio where I record the Serial Killer podcast. This is the best astronomy cast. It has been going for 10 years. It's the best astronomy podcast named Astronomy Cast. It's just fantastic. 1 episode a week, not during summer. It's been going for 10 years and I just love it. I'm not really listening to Sjöhistorisk pod. It's a pod about marine history, but I talked to them about doing an episode for them. That didn't pan out, but I haven't listened to it yet, so I should probably just delete it from here. Go away. Okay, so here is my serial killer podcast. A lot of work, a lot of fun. Great things to expect there if you listen to it. We have just started. No Sleep and Sword and Scale are 2 podcasts I've been recommended for true crime. I haven't attached myself to them yet. I have one on my iPod from Sword and Scale that I will try to listen to. Decoding Westworld, Johanna and David, my favorite Game of Thrones podcasters, they did an excellent review of Westworld, but Johanna kept guessing about what was going to happen, and she was actually guessing, but she guessed everything right. So the whole season was spoiled, which was crazy. This is the biggest true crime podcast in Sweden. I listen to it, absolutely. I think it's structured in seasons, and that's just why do you do that? But they probably don't have time. They make every episode top-notch quality, and then you just don't get episodes. And I disagree strongly with that. That's going to be one of my podcasting lessons for the podcasting school on this channel. Here is a podcast, another true crime podcast that looked very promising, published one episode, then no other episode. People have said that I should listen to Historiepodden. It's the biggest Swedish history podcast. I haven't really. I've listened to one of them, The American Presidents, and it didn't catch me. Here is another true crime podcast. I listened to like random episodes of it, interesting cases. They mix real true crime with like imaginary true crime, and I don't know, didn't catch on. It's hard for a podcast to catch on for me. I listen to a ton of podcasts, but to really listen to every episode takes a lot. Here is another Swedish true crime podcast that I listen to more than Svenska Mordhistoria, but not as much as Mordpodden. He is using recorded stuff from the trials, and I am too scared to use that because I don't think you have the right for that, and I think you could get banned on YouTube and stuff, as I work a lot with YouTube, so that's why I haven't done that yet. Here is an excellent history podcast. I have binge listened to this one. The History of Byzantium, that's the story of Rome after Rome falls, i.e. the story of Rome 476 AD to 1453 AD. And it's amazing. It's a continuation of the History of Rome podcast, and it's just great. I love it. Very, very dry academic podcast, just like Mike Duncan's History of Rome, and I just adore that. So super great. Here is my Pokemon podcast. It's cancelled. I'm sorry. It just didn't catch on. This is the only Magic podcast I listen to right now. I used to listen to a ton of Magic podcasts. We'll probably find them further down, but this one is the best. It's about Pauper. It's the #1 Pauper podcast. I just love it. So if you play Magic and play Pauper, you really should listen to this. P4 documentaries and P1 documentaries are just the verse versions of P3 documentary, but I do listen to them from time to time. Here's a true crime podcast that has taken the concept of seasons to a horrible level. They overproduce episodes like once. Are there 6 episodes a year? Or 6 episodes every 6 months? Or even 5 episodes for the second half of 2016. I can't stand it. It's great. It's amazing. It's like P3 documentary style, but there's just too few episodes. So I just forget about it. Here is Cecilia's yoga podcast. She has been a guest on Palmemordet 2 times. And she will be back as Lisbeth Palme. Here is my murder podcast. This is the podcast I put the most work into. This is about the unresolved murder of Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme in 1986. And I will keep doing that podcast until we solve the murder or I run out of topic. But it is the biggest crime investigation without a solution in all of world history. So we'll keep going. Here is another podcast on the same subject by a guy from south of Sweden who is a stand-up comedian. It's much more fun and much less knowledge than my podcast. So we complement each other quite well. P3 Documentary is the best Swedish podcast, but it's a radio company. It's the government radio company. Puts a ton of effort. I bet there are like 15 people working on every episode. So this is the golden standard of Swedish podcasting. Ancient World was very good in the original episodes. I've lost it here. Oh, there's an episode on Semiramis. Whoa. And it includes Caracalla. Interesting. Okay, here is probably my second most favorite podcast. And it comes out much more regularly than my favorite podcast. So it might be my favorite podcast. The last podcast on the left, 3 improvisation comedians from New York doing true crime and aliens and ghosts and creepypasta. It's just amazing. Love it. A friend told me to listen to In Our Time. I found it was too dry even for me. That's surprising. I will maybe give it another shot. This is my Legend of the Ice People podcast with Anna. This is a very good Magic podcast that I should listen to, but I don't listen to many Magic podcasts now. Here is another true crime podcast that is amazing. It's better than Spore, but it also has like 6 episodes every year actually, and that doesn't work. Here is a Crusade podcast that I still haven't deleted, but I haven't listened to it a lot. The Crusade's very interesting. I would want to cover that myself. Here's a Game of Thrones podcast. They are all dead now, of course, because we're still waiting for season 7. So I'm going to skip all of them. This is the second best, I think. And the best one is, we'll come to that. Here's a podcast on Alexander the Great that seems to have stopped. That's not good. I should listen to Cam and Ray's Alexander the Great. And here it is. This is a pay podcast. You pay every month you pay like $5 to listen to the podcast. But I got it for free because and on my other computer. Because I reviewed Cameron Riley's book on this channel. More Game of Thrones, more Game of Thrones, more Game of Thrones. The Life of Caesar premium podcast that I'm not a subscriber of. Life of Caesar, amazing. Julius Caesar, Augustus, super good history podcasting. Cameron Riley and Ray Harris. Wow, this is Cameron Riley's big inspiration for me. Brainstorm Brewery. Did they cancel? I don't think they canceled. This is the MTG Finance podcast. Limited Resources, the best MTG podcast. I'm not listening to it. The finance podcasts, I never listened to them. I thought like studying finance podcasts should be good, but it was just way too boring. Here's my own Game of Thrones podcast, Game of Thrones Chat. Hey, I lied to you earlier. I still listen to another Magic podcast, and it's this one, the Masters of Modern. I think it's the best modern podcast about the modern format. And this is on my iPod right now, so I am up to date with this one. So yeah, it's awesome. Fan of History, my own podcast, my longest running podcast, and probably the podcast I love the most of my own podcasts. It's just my baby. I'm sorry, Serial Killer Cast and Palmemordet. This is another podcast we canceled last year. It was our Magic podcast, but the guys I did it with, Brennan and Sam, they are doing Cubelicious. Sweet. This is my favorite podcast. Dan Carlin's Hardcore History. So good. But look at the dates. There's been 2 episodes in 2016. And that means that Last Podcast on the Left probably deserves the crown. But Dan Carlin, wow. Just wow. He's so good. China History Podcast. I've tried to catch up on Chinese history here, but I haven't become attached to it. I binge listened to World War II podcast, but I dropped out during Barbarossa and I just haven't gotten back in. When I was really caught up in the World War II podcast, I tried to listen to the World War I podcast as well, but it's not from the same guy, and this guy was less charming than Ray. Another Magic podcast. So, a lot of Magic podcasts. Game of Thrones. Here is an interesting podcast that I sometimes listen to. It contains a lot of mythic and legendary stuff, but it's an attempt, just like Timeline of World History on my Fan of History channel, the YouTube show, to cover all of world history in a podcast. And it leaves me wanting a lot more, but it's still an attempt to do that. So I listen to it. Here is History of Rome. It hasn't been, it's been off the air since 2012, but it's still amazing. Still one of the best podcasts ever made. 5 years of Roman history. I don't even know what this is. This is the Swedish Science Radio's history show. I tend to listen to every episode here. It's really good. This is the guy who is the chief engineer of Magic the Gathering and his podcast about making magic. That's one of my favorite Magic podcasts, but I'm not up to date with it right now. And here we have the master history podcaster himself, Mike Duncan, and his current podcast, Revolutions. He just finished the Bolivar history, and I'm waiting for more here. I did listen to all of these. Yes, I did. So those are my current podcasts. If you have any recommendation for me, I am really looking for serial killer podcasts now to get some inspiration. But I found a lot of the American serial killer podcasts to be very boring. They sort of push books and focus on other things than serial killers, which feels wrong to me. Also, of course, I'm interested in super ancient history, like before the Greeks and the Romans. That's kind of the podcasts I'm looking for now. Maybe I should listen to one more astronomy podcast because of my fan of astronomy. So that's it. I have not updated this for my latest, my own podcast, the latest ones. So I should add them. Let's add them. Fan of astronomy, my astronomy podcast, together with Angelo. We have done 4 episodes. You should give Fan of Astronomy a listen. Angelo is so good, and I think we have super good chemistry. Hard Nerd Cafe still hasn't appeared on iTunes. And here is my training podcast. This is me, and this is Anna, not the same Anna that I do Hard Nerd Cafe and Legend of the Ice People with, but she owns a gym. She has been working as a gym instructor and coach for 20 years. And she has the task to get me into shape. And that's what this podcast is about in Swedish. Okay, that's all for today. Thank you for watching.